All right. Welcome, welcome. Thank you to everyone who is joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Understanding Extended Producer Responsibility for Packaging in Maine. And thank you to everyone who is watching this recording on YouTube. Maine's Extended Producer Responsibility for Packaging, or EPR, is a first in the nation law that aims to shift the financial burden of packaging waste management from taxpayers to producers, encouraging more sustainable packaging solutions and advancing the state's recycling goals. We are so lucky to have with us today an incredible expert in this field. Vanessa Berry is the Sustainable Maine Program Manager for the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and one of my favorite people to talk trash with. Vanessa is going to walk us through how Maine passed this landmark legislation, how EPR works, and how each of us can support this important initiative. Thank you so much for being with us today, Vanessa. My name is Kathleen Neal. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCV does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate. And MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, our policy priorities, the climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we dive in. We will hear from Vanessa first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A at the end. You can send questions to me or to Maggie Summers through the chat whenever they occur to you, and we'll synthesize them and ask as many of them as possible in the following the presentation. We ask that you not message Vanessa directly so she can keep her focus on the presentation, not the chat box, but never fear. We're going to share her contact information in the follow-up email later this afternoon. And we've already talked about how eager she is to connect with all of you to answer more questions. If you have any technical difficulties today, Maggie is the one to help you out. Just send her a message through the chat and she will work her magic. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You'll also get the link in a follow-up email, and you can find recordings of all of our programs on YouTube. We've got a bunch of different playlists that can help you focus in on particular topics. And if trash is what you're looking for, there are quite a few programs that will dig into how we're dealing with waste management here in Maine. Thank you all for joining us. And Vanessa, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Perfect. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen so that way you can all see all the good stuff I got to share with you today. And how's that? Does that work? Perfect. Seeing thumbs up. Amazing. Thank you so much to Maine Conservation Voters for inviting me to talk with you all today about Maine's EPR for packaging law. My name is Vanessa Berry, and I'm the Sustainable Maine Program Manager for the Natural Resources Council of Maine. NRCM is a nonprofit membership organization devoted to protecting, restoring, and conserving Maine's environment for now and for future generations. For more than 60 years, the Natural Resources Council of Maine has been protecting the places and way of life that make Maine so special. NRCM harnesses the power of the law, science, and the voices of more than 30,000 supporters statewide and beyond to protect the health of Maine rivers, lakes, streams, and coastal waters, promote sustainable communities through initiatives that reduce toxic pollution and waste, decrease air and climate changing pollution through energy efficiency and renewable sources, conserve Maine lands and wildlife habitat, including our treasured North Maine woods, and defend the federal environmental policies and programs that help protect Maine. As NRCM's Sustainable Maine Program Manager and resident trash talker, I work with passionate individuals, local committees, municipal staff, and members of the business community to reduce unnecessary waste and advance reuse, repair, recycling, and composting infrastructure here in Maine. This is why I am thrilled to be here today to talk about Maine's EPR for Packaging program and all that this law will do for our communities. To give a quick overview, I'm going to spend some time describing our current system, explain what EPR in Maine will look like, and then share some updates on where we are kind of in the process of implementing this program. I also look forward to answering all of your thoughtful questions. We'll save some time at the end to address questions from attendees, so please send those questions to Kathleen in the chat. If we run out of time, I'm more than happy to connect with folks after this lunch and learn, and we will be also sending out a follow-up, which will include some additional resources for you. I first have a video to share before we get started.
Here in the great state of Maine, we don't like to waste money or throw anything away that can be reused. We also know that reducing waste, reusing, and recycling are some of the most important things we can do to protect our environment. But these days, it seems like everything's overpackaged and wrapped in plastic. We get pretty irritated when a label says the packaging can be recycled, but there aren't any bins to put it in. The people labeling this stuff need to stop this nonsense. Tons and tons of this wasteful packaging not only makes climate change worse, it also forces taxpayers to pay millions of dollars for a problem they didn't create. That's why Maine took inspiration from our state motto, Dare a Go, and became the first state in the nation to pass an extended producer responsibility for packaging law to make packaging producers pay their fair share of the costs to manage all of their packaging waste. Here's how it works. It's based on a simple polluter pays principle. Large packaging companies pay fees to a new independent organization. The less packaging and more recyclable material they use, the less they pay. This helps encourage these companies to design better packaging, to create less waste and less plastic. The money collected is used to reimburse towns and cities for the cost of managing the producer's waste. This means that instead of throwing tax dollars in the trash, we can fix roads, invest in education, or lower taxes. The EPR for Packaging program also provides money to encourage reuse and make recycling systems more effective. A lot of businesses support this type of law because it's the right thing to do. But unfortunately, there are some greedy corporations that would rather spend millions to spread all sorts of misinformation about our new law so they can keep making taxpayers pay to clean up their mess. But the facts don't lie. Places that have EPR for packaging laws have much higher recycling rates than we do because companies have a reason to use less packaging, and they pay for recycling programs too, all without raising prices on consumer goods. That's why we need to continue to fight for strong EPR for packaging laws around the country and stop corporations from weakening these laws and trying to avoid responsibility. People want products, not packaging. We need a recycling system that works for us and not against us. When it comes to protecting our environment, we are all in this together, and EPR for packaging laws are an important part of the solution.
All right.
Vanessa, I have to just jump in and say, that was amazing. I love that video so much. Thank you.
Yes, and a little shout out to Representative Dudera, who did the voiceover for that video. It's always kind of fun to hear her voice on that other side of the YouTube screen. So yeah, just a little blurb there. Fun fact for folks who might not know or recognize her voice. But yeah, we'll get started. I think that one kind of grounds us really well, but I'm sure many of you know a thing or two about recycling programs and how they might get managed here in Maine, particularly in your community. But I also wanted to start by sharing Maine's solid waste management hierarchy, which was adopted in 1989, along with some statewide recycling goals. So we set a goal to recycle and divert 25% of Maine's waste by 1992, and then achieve a 50% recycling rate by 1994, which is an ambitious goal. But of course, this goal proved to be a lot more challenging than expected. And even 30 years later, here in 2024, we have yet to achieve a 50% recycling rate for our waste. Today, our recycling rate sits around 34%, and the amount of waste that we generate per capita has continued to grow year over year. So we're recycling the same amounts, but we are generating more trash. As a primarily home rule state, we often find that individual communities operate their own unique systems to provide for essential services for things like education, road maintenance, and managing household trash. It's very common for towns to host a drop-off facility for residents to bring their trash recycling and other common waste materials. However, in more densely populated and urban areas of the state, you might find that some communities opt for curbside pickup service that efficiently collects trash and recycling from house to house. So regardless of how you do it, it might look a little different depending on where you live. And if you move from one town to the next town over, you might have a different process for how you manage recycling. Communities also differ in how recycling is collected from individual residents. So depending on the destination for your recyclables, your town may have a single stream recycling collection with all the different materials commingled together to be sorted later at a material recovery facility. In the biz, they affectionately call that a MRF. Or your town might require your residents to sort their own material into paper, steel, aluminum, and different types of plastics so that they can be sold directly to a manufacturer. Regardless of the process that your community might participate in, the costs of managing recycling and solid waste programs fall directly onto municipalities. And this costs Maine taxpayers roughly $16 to $17 million per year in packaging materials alone. One of the biggest shocks to the municipal cost of managing recycling became very apparent during a global recycling market crash in 2018. Over time, the United States, among others around the world, became very dependent on international markets for recycling, sending millions of tons of household recycling, primarily paper and plastics, overseas to manufacturing industries in China, India, Malaysia, Vietnam, and beyond. However, while we shipped countless vessels of recycled materials overseas, we also sent plenty of trash, causing excessive contamination in the recycling and passing along our waste problems for other countries to manage. In 2018, China implemented their national sword policy, which is a ban on many imported recycling streams. And it served as a huge wake-up call to the industry and reminded us of the importance of resilient local solutions for managing the waste we create. It also highlighted another issue, the issue of excessive unnecessary packaging and product greenwashing. I'm sure many of you have encountered the frustrations of confusing labeling and the overuse of that classic recycling symbol with the chasing arrows. In the wake of this major disruption to recycling, many towns were forced to make impossible choices. They either needed to forfeit or scale back their existing recycling programs, or ask taxpayers to spend more money to recycle than it would cost communities to throw these items into the trash. During this time, recycling rates in Maine dropped from 38% in 2017 to 34% in 2021. But NRCM and some of our fellow environmental organizations saw this disruption as an opportunity to redesign the way we tackle our waste. What if we could create a sort of insurance program for recycling that could keep these items out of the trash in good markets and in bad markets? How could Maine improve our current system and shift away from a process that requires municipalities to simply react to the barrage of packaging materials for consumer goods and allows us to proactively prevent this problem in the future? I like to think of waste like an overflowing bathtub, and the waste that we create is overwhelming and difficult to clean up. And this is why we need solutions that address the root cause of the problem and turn off, or at least slow down, the generation of waste at the source. Instead of relying on our recycling solutions or our landfills to react to materials after they've been created, much like bailing water or grabbing a mop to clean up what's already there in my bathtub analogy, we've got to address what's coming out of the tap. So extended producer responsibility for packaging is designed to address the root source of packaging waste by placing some of the management burden back onto the producers who create the waste. Here in the US, producers who sell consumer goods often externalize the impacts and the costs of their packaging because they have no stake in managing it at the end of its usefulness. The packaging becomes a consumer's problem as soon as they buy the item inside. So by holding companies accountable for the end of life of their packaging, we encourage them to focus on how that packaging will impact our communities and our natural environment, which can inspire more recyclable packaging design and even help to eliminate unnecessary packaging. EPR for packaging exists in places all around the world. Most notably, there are jurisdictions in Canada that implement this program and many in Europe that serve as great examples for how producers can support and encourage recycling here in Maine. We're also not doing this alone here in the United States. While we were the first state to officially pass EPR for packaging, which is really awesome, we were shortly followed by Colorado, Oregon, California, and most recently, Minnesota passed an EPR for packaging law just this year. Maine already has a highly successful track record of implementing product stewardship and EPR programs, and that starts as early as Maine's bottle bill for recycling beverage containers in the late 70s. And it's expanded to collect and manage many other types of problematic waste materials, including things like batteries, mercury-containing items like thermostats, auto switches, and lamps, electronics and cell phones, architectural paint, and pharmaceuticals. These programs work because the producers of these tricky materials have to provide some level of financial and/or logistical support in the management of these items, taking some level of responsibility for what happens to them once they reach the end of their life. And on July 12th, 2021, Maine became the very first state in the country to pass extended producer responsibility for product packaging. Hundreds of Maine people, dozens of municipalities, recyclers, and even some members of the business community came together at the State House to voice their support for this program, asking lawmakers to implement this proven solution to our recycling challenges that make these systems more effective, more sustainable, and more equitable. EPR for packaging makes recycling more effective by utilizing producer payments to fund investments in recycling and reuse infrastructure, and encourages design changes that make packaging more recyclable and reduce unnecessary packaging. So no more boxes inside of boxes when you order something off of Amazon, hopefully. EPR also makes our recycling systems more sustainable through reimbursements to municipalities that help stabilize the cost of recycling and allow towns to keep recycling when costs would otherwise be a barrier. Like a waste management insurance policy, municipalities receive more financial support to manage their recycling when the markets are down, and it helps to ensure the costs of recovering materials are not higher than the cost of disposal, which often encourage more landfilling in the state. And EPR is a more equitable way of managing packaging because it holds producers who make the packaging financially accountable for their waste, rather than Maine communities and taxpayers. And it helps allow for more widespread access to recycling across Maine. The money collected from producers will provide reimbursements to municipalities to help manage the cost of their programs, which supports towns from every corner of Maine, however they recycle their packaging. After the rules of this program are finalized, which is coming really soon, and I'll tell you more about that in a bit, the Maine Department of Environmental Protection is tasked with selecting a third-party stewardship organization to help run the program. And we'll refer to this as the SO for short. The SO collects information from producers of packaging and assigns appropriate fees to cover administrative costs, municipal reimbursements, and eco-modulated fees that can be applied that encourage clear labeling, the use of recycled content, and discourage the use of added toxins in packaging. The SO also works with participating Maine municipalities who will start to collect a baseline list of packaging materials that are readily recyclable. And then they report the costs of collecting, handling, transporting, and processing packaging materials so that they can get reimbursed. This is an optional program for municipalities to participate in, but it's our hope that we can encourage as many communities to participate as possible to help them receive the support they need to recycle. As part of operating the program, the SO provides advice to producers and municipalities to help everyone reduce costs, manage material efficiently and effectively, and achieve program goals set by the department. They also manage a designated fund that can be used to create new or improved recycling infrastructure. So, for example, if a region of the state is needing support with consolidating materials for transportation because it's too costly to send things directly from their town to a processor, that fund could be used to make that happen and increase recycling in underserved areas of the state that don't currently have good access. By implementing EPR for packaging here in Maine, we help communities by addressing the source of packaging waste and turning down the tap. This program uses fees to incentivize producers to reduce their packaging, create opportunities to reuse packaging, and design packaging to be easier to recycle at home. With these incentives, Maine communities should eventually have less packaging waste to manage overall, which is a win for Maine's environment and for all of our communities who are paying for that stuff. Reimbursements cover a wide array of management costs and provide a strong financial incentive for municipalities to participate in recycling. And the money collected from producers also provides additional grant funds that can be used to help expand Maine's recycling infrastructure and improve statewide access to recycling options. Packaging that comes into Maine will be placed into two distinct categories. They'll be called readily recyclable or non-readily recyclable. Producers who improve the recyclability of their packaging will pay less than those who opt for packaging that needs to be disposed of in Maine landfills or incinerators. And communities who recycle will not only have ongoing financial support through the reimbursements, but they'll also see improvements in the quality of the recycling because producers will adjust their packaging to be more readily recyclable. So better recyclable packaging helps make the packaging that we're recycling easier to recycle. Lastly, with the creation of a baseline list of readily recyclable materials, and participating towns will be required to accept those materials, there's going to be opportunities for more consistent statewide education around what can be recycled. So if everyone has to accept this baseline material list, then that means that we can teach to that list. We can tell every community that if you're recycling and participating in EPR, that these materials are acceptable, whether you live in a northern Maine community that's very rural, that doesn't have a curbside program, but a drop-off, versus you live in a city where you have a curbside, very efficient collection system. All of the lists will be the same. So we can teach to it, and it makes it a lot more consistent compared to what we're doing right now. Through the fee structure in the EPR program, producers of packaging are going to be encouraged to use accurate labeling too. So with more consistent education on what can be placed in the bin and clear disposal instructions directly on the packaging from producers, recyclers can keep their materials clean and free of unwanted contamination, also making it easier for them to recycle all this good stuff. So we know people have lots and lots of questions about how EPR will work here in Maine. And thankfully, we have a lot of helpful models for EPR in other places that give us a solid foundation to build from. Having EPR for packaging in other places also tells us that international brands are participating in this elsewhere, and that it's more than possible for them to comply with the law here in Maine and in other parts of the US. So if they can do this in Canada, they can certainly do it here in Maine, and they can do it in Oregon, and they can do it in California, and they can do it in Minnesota, and all of these other states that are trying to implement this policy. So take this list, for example. We know that our neighboring jurisdictions in British Columbia, there are dozens of international brands that participate in their EPR program, including brands like Benjamin Moore, Betty Crocker, Campbell's, so Soup Company, Microsoft, Amazon, Tim Hortons, you name it. We've also learned that a majority of the cost to manage packaging in British Columbia are covered by the wealthiest 5% of producers. So about 80% of the program costs are funded by 5% of businesses that are participating in the program. So not only do producers participate and pay their fair share in other places, but our neighbors in Canada also achieve higher rates of recycling with their EPR programs. Some regions are far exceeding 70% recycling rates. So this means that this is a proven strategy to also help us increase our recycling rates, a goal in which we've never yet achieved here in the state of Maine. So hopefully with EPR in place, we're on track to meet those recycling goals. When drafting this policy, Maine also considered the impacts on small businesses. We wanted to ensure that Maine's local business communities were not hard hit by producer fees for their packaging. So Maine's EPR law has an exemption for Maine small businesses that generate less than $2 million in gross revenue, generate less than 1 ton of packaging, and have less than 100 full-time staff. In the case of a local franchise, like a national chain coffee shop or a fast food dining establishment, the responsibility is shifted back onto the parent company to fund the management of that packaging, not the individual owners of those franchises. Another important question that gets raised in discussions about EPR is, do these fees just simply get passed along to consumers? And thankfully, in other countries that implement EPR for packaging programs, we have found that there's no evidence that producers increase the cost of consumer goods. And instead, we find that producers try to reduce their overall costs by reducing their packaging and offering bulk and reuse options and addressing other areas of waste throughout the manufacturing process to help offset these fees. It's also helpful to note that the costs per package are typically very, very small. So for example, in Quebec's EPR program, they charge less than $3 for every 1,000 yogurt cups that enter the market. These costs certainly add up for the big businesses producing millions or billions of their product, but each individual container costs fractions of a penny for producers to place on the shelf. With the funds collected from producers, Maine communities will be able to provide stronger recycling programs and reduce the tax burden that packaging creates. And by freeing up some of the money that towns are already spending to manage packaging, we could see investments in many other essential services or lower property taxes, which is a win for us. But before I turn it over to Kathleen to help address all of your questions, I want to remind you that Maine's EPR program has a few more steps before it becomes a reality for Maine communities. And we really need your support to help this program get over the finish line. The Maine Department of Environmental Protection is currently seeking public comments on the proposed rules for this EPR program before it goes to a vote for the Board of Environmental Protection. And this is a perfect opportunity to remind decision makers how important this will be for Maine's people, for our communities, and our environment. NRCM has created an action alert to encourage supporters to weigh in during this critical point in EPR's implementation. And we strongly encourage everyone on this call to submit their comments. Your voice is super important at this point. So look for the follow-up email after this lunch and learn with all the details on how to take action during this important moment in EPR's history for Maine. And additionally, once the EPR rules are approved, hopefully very soon, we need Maine communities to sign up and receive that sweet, sweet reimbursement. So share fact sheets, call your recycling committee or your public works department or your town manager, and ask them if they've heard the good news about EPR and if they know how to get involved. NRCM is here to make this program a success. We want Maine to be a leader in this space and help other states implement these policies. And so we want to support municipalities in this journey. So feel free to forward them along to NRCM and provide some resources that NRCM has created for municipalities to help them get on board. Lastly, NRCM strongly supports Maine's solid waste management hierarchy. So please remember to reduce, reuse, and then recycle. Recycling is number 3 on that waste hierarchy for a reason. It's not the solution to the problem. Only when we rethink the waste that we create can we turn off the tap. We have tons of great resources on NRCM's website to help you find businesses that support zero waste, offer you tools to advocate in your communities, and so much more. So for resources and tons of trash talk, which I love to do, visit nrcm.org and check out our sustainability page. And then I just want to say again, thank you so much to MCV for hosting this Lunch and Learn, and a big thank you to everyone who tuned in. With support from organizations, businesses, recyclers, and all of you, we feel very confident that this program is going to be successful. So let's turn it over to hear all of your amazing questions. And I'll stop sharing so we can see everybody's beautiful faces.
Vanessa, thank you so much. I just absolutely love hearing you talk about trash and about the future of our waste management system. I just am so grateful for the enthusiasm that you bring and that we can do it attitude, because this is a pressing issue. It feels like every day there's a new story in the local papers about the challenges that towns are facing about waste management. I know there is a huge field of work beyond EPR, so want to just acknowledge that and thank you for everything you do in that world. And want to let everybody know that the Climate Council, the Maine Climate Council, for the first time this year this round has a designated task force on materials management, because this is a front and center issue, and it is just really exciting that Maine is already leading the way. And we're going to share a whole bunch of follow-up materials after this. You'll get a link to Maine DEP's page where they're explaining EPR from their perspective. You'll get a link to NRCM's information. You can do a little compare and contrast, see where everybody's lining up. You'll also get links to submit public comments to let the Department of Environmental Protection know how important this program really is, and that you've done your homework and you know it can work. So it's on them to make it work. You'll also get information about how to kick off a conversation with your town leaders. Whether you know it or not, there are people in your town who are thinking about trash 24/7. So Vanessa's got some great starting questions to kick off the conversation with them. And you'll also get Vanessa's follow-up or email information so you guys can continue this conversation. Okay, that's a lot. We have a million great questions and I can't wait to dig in. Vanessa, I really appreciated you starting with the who's paying for recycling now and who's paying attention to this. And can you just remind us, recap, like who's paying for recycling right now? And is EPR going to change that?
Yeah, so just to kind of explain how it typically works is, so Maine is kind of on the hook for providing, or communities are on the hook for providing solid waste and recycling services. So each individual community kind of does this in their own unique way. So regardless of if you live in Portland or, you know, Boothbay Harbor, your programs are going to look very different, depending on how your town decides to manage the material, what companies they might work with to find homes for this stuff. And it really does fall on the municipal solid waste budgets, which are a huge chunk of a municipal budget. So if you really love diving into financials, talk to your town and just see how much money that they're earmarking for managing solid waste in a given year. It's pretty astronomical. It's like, you know, there's that and there's the schools, and they do take up a huge chunk of the budget for a community. So that means that it's paid for by property taxes. And that's been the system for the last, 50 plus years, is that the municipalities have the responsibility to provide this essential service. And the producers have kind of just handed this stuff off. They put it out into the market and then they wash their hands and they say, we don't have to think about this anymore because it's on you. So this policy will help flip that a little bit, and it'll make the producers responsible for reimbursing communities the cost. So it's still in the purview of the town to decide how they want to recycle. They're going to get some really good advice on like best practices, things that help them save money and do things more efficiently. But we really wanted to make sure that we didn't disrupt the whole system with this EPR for packaging program, because so many towns already have really good programs in place. And some towns don't have anything, so they're starting from scratch. But we didn't want to completely undermine the really good work and the investments that lots of towns have already made to provide for solid waste and recycling services for their residents. So this builds on the existing system for managing solid waste, but it's going to improve it, and it's going to use this fee structure for producers to help reimburse those costs. So municipalities will have, they'll see a check cut out at the end of the year to help them offset that cost and either lower taxes, or they can allocate that money for next year's solid waste budget and pay less on that, or however they want to reallocate that money, but it helps them offset the cost of managing these programs.
That's so helpful. And it sounds like there's been a lot of thought going behind the program design. Does that explain some of the timeline here? Because you said 2021, we passed this law, but it doesn't sound like EPR is happening yet. Say
Correct.
more about where we are and when do we get to say it's a go, it's really happening?
Yeah, exactly. So it does take a long time, and it took a while to get this policy passed. I mean, they started these conversations back in 2018, kind of when that recycling crisis happened. It really woke us up to the idea that we needed more sustainable solutions and we needed a way to stabilize these costs so that the onus isn't on municipalities to make those hard choices. So basically, if we'd had EPR back in 2018, a lot of these towns would probably still be recycling that had to forego their programs in the first place. This is just kind of an added insurance policy, but it takes a while because the department has done a lot of research, a lot of stakeholder engagement to figure out what the landscape of recycling looks like in Maine. And like we said, we don't want to undo all of the great, amazing work and all of the investments that have already been made to manage this material. And we've trusted municipalities to run their recycling programs for decades. So we're not doing away with that system. We're going to keep the existing system, but we're going to try to make it better. And so this is what the producer payments will do. And then there's also this additional money for all of this investment that can happen to create markets for tricky to recycle materials, or create economies of scale where a region that might not have a good might not have good infrastructure right now, we can invest money to make that infrastructure better. So it takes a little while to plan for all of those things, and it's been a comprehensive look at the recycling system and how packaging gets managed in the state. So we started stakeholder engagement almost 2 years ago now, and they've had meetings. It was like monthly meetings for 4 or 5 hours at a time with all sorts of municipal officials, with people from the recycling industry, with environmental groups such as NRCM, but really getting engaged in all of the processes for determining program goals. How will we be auditing this process to make sure that everybody's playing a fair game and paying their fair share. So those conversations took a long time, and we finally have proposed rules. And once those rules are approved, which I'm hoping will happen in September without any delays, that's why we need your support to drive this home. But we're hoping that once these rules are approved, that will streamline the process, and we should see municipal reimbursements coming in 2027. So we're not that far away now, but we're in the home stretch, and we really need to make sure that these rules get implemented and the municipalities can get the support that they need.
That is so exciting. And I love this position that we find ourselves in Maine, where we're leading the nation, but we also have so many examples of where EPR has been in place for a while, right? And it was absolutely wild to see that slide that you shared with all of the global companies that are already complying with EPR and paying for it. And so I just have to ask the question, are they using more wasteful packaging in places where they can get away with it? Why isn't that reality in British Columbia translating to better packaging worldwide?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think a lot of it is because of these externalities that I kind of mentioned. So producers don't have to pay for the environmental impact of the packaging that they create in the States until now. But they haven't had to pay for the, harmful toxins that, people are exposed to through packaging. They haven't had to pay for all of those kind of other costs that they just pass along for municipalities and for the individual consumers to deal with. So, making those an internalized cost it is cheaper to switch to the more sustainable types of packaging. And that's why we see those behavior changes happening in places where EPR is being implemented. And not only are we seeing design changes in the packaging to make it more readily recyclable and easier for consumers, but we're also seeing reductions in packaging. We're seeing more built bulk stations at the stores and refill options and take back programs where they're assuming responsibility for the containers. So we're seeing a lot more of those systems in other places that implement EPR as well. So hopefully that will become more normalized, because reuse really does address a lot of the problems that we're seeing, in that if we need the packaging, but we only need it for like 5 seconds, how can we make that more circular and actually like extend the lifespan of these things, so that it's not only useful for 15 seconds and then it's immediately going into the landfill. So finding ways to change the packaging that actually like increase its longevity is really beneficial part of this program that we're hoping that we'll see and see that transition happen pretty quickly once the fees start rolling in for producers.
And I guess some of that natural, or that not natural, but that inevitable evolution towards more sustainable packaging, that explains why I'm starting to see things like this box contains, X% less waste, or this cap on your water bottle is less, that those changes are happening, but we need to just up the stakes for producers, and money's a great way to do that, I guess.
Yeah, and reuse is a really good solution for a lot of these businesses. There are lots of things that we buy every day that we don't need. We either don't need the packaging and we can eliminate it altogether, right? Like, who needs a cardboard sleeve for their toothpaste tube? Not me. But it also encourages more, like I said, of these like refill stations where if you need a package in order to transport the goods, like shampoo and conditioner, it's not something you can just like take that in your hands package free. But they're creating these systems where you can reuse and refill your containers and keeping them in circularity for longer, which again reduces the carbon footprint of the packaging as it's being created. So we're addressing some climate issues as well. And I'm glad that, Kathleen, that you brought up the materials management task force, because we spent a lot of time talking about circular solutions and reuse and how can we incentivize all of these behaviors. And I'm really excited to see what EPR will do to advance these goals. So I think that they go hand in hand, all of the things that we're talking about related to solid waste and climate, because solid waste issues are climate issues. When things have to go into a landfill, we go back to nature and we're extracting things at the source, and that doesn't have, no footprint. It's a pretty significant footprint in consumption-based emissions. And to be able to disrupt some of those systems is really, really helpful.
Absolutely. We've got some really good questions on the nitty-gritty of this. So I'm gonna hit you with some. What's the magnitude that we're talking about here? And I know it's going to be different in every town, but we've got an example of, we're pulling numbers out of the air here. If my town is spending $5,000 a month on recycling, like I said, no idea whether that's a reasonable number, but it'll work for this. Can we expect 100%, 50%, 5% of that to be reimbursed through EPR? What are we talking?
Yeah, so the way that the EPR for packaging law is designed is we're breaking municipalities up into similar municipalities. So for northern communities, it's broken up into more population dense and less population dense. There are 4 categories in which we're sorting. So we're looking at like southern Maine populations. Their urban areas have a very different landscape for recycling and management than more rural parts of southern Maine. So they've broken up into 4 different groups of similar municipalities, and the municipalities will report on their costs. And this is the cost of managing the packaging material. So for example, like your junk mail or like other types of recyclables, packaging does make up a huge percentage of what we're recycling on a day-to-day basis. It's also a huge percentage of what we throw away, but it's not all of it. So It may not cover the full cost of your solid waste budget, but it covers the cost of the packaging material that's coming out of your solid waste budget, which can be substantial. But we break it up into those groups because they all kind of experience maybe similar costs in managing their materials. If they've got, maybe you've got folks with curbside programs that's really expensive, but they also operate a transfer station, so that's very expensive. And they've got high populations, so it's kind of spread out amongst a lot of different taxpayers. So these systems have kind of been worked out where we're putting them into these groups that make sense, and they get reimbursed the average cost of managing packaging for those groups. So some towns might actually see that they're getting higher reimbursements if they're running really efficient recycling systems. And for those who may have less efficient collection, they may not get the full reimbursement for their program, but then they're going to get a lot of information on what their neighbors are doing to help them maybe reduce costs, create more efficiencies, work together, and things like that. So it may not be the full cost of managing your program, but to get a good idea, your towns could already start thinking about, how much of this is our packaging material, how much are we spending in, staffing capacity, in collection, in the equipment that we have to use to operate a transfer station, in transportation of the material, which can be really expensive for some communities, depending on where you are. So start thinking about all of those costs because they're all going to get factored into this reimbursement. And that can be really, really helpful for towns. So we encourage them to start thinking about these things now and to talk to us if they have questions and want to kind of work through it a little bit. But I know some towns who have been talking about EPR and have been tuned in have started looking at their budget to see the potential, and they're getting really excited. So it's not nothing.
That's amazing. And so you mentioned the 4 different areas or buckets of similar towns. Is every town in each of those categories, will they get the same reimbursement that's an average, or is it this town? I'm just trying to get a sense of, is somebody standing there picking out every single yogurt cup and tallying them up and saying, okay, and it's this, $266 for 100 yogurt cups, check, or is it bigger? How
it's
are we?
definitely, we're going to be getting averages from municipalities. So we'll have these 4 groups of similar municipalities. So northern and southern communities have been kind of divided in by geography, but then we also have some population categories. So in northern Maine, there's, places with a certain population that's a little bit higher and another population that's a little bit lower. They're going to be grouped together because we might assume that they have similar solid waste budgets and things like that. So those groups are going to get their average of all the towns that are in that similar municipality group. So they'll actually be able to see kind of what their neighbors are reporting for costs and say, oh, you're running a program that's really low cost, but you're getting a lot of recycling tonnage out of it. So how are you doing that? So there's going to be good opportunities for them to kind of talk to each other, figure out how to make the system more efficient, and the stewardship organization will help facilitate this too. So they're going to be reporting out on the cost to manage their programs. All the municipalities who participate are going to be required to do some level of reporting. There will be some audits that get done at the local level to figure out, how much packaging we're talking about in the recycling streams, what producers are contributing to that packaging. There's going to be a lot of data which is involved in this. And historically, we haven't had a lot of good solid waste data. So I'm really excited about that part because we're going to see a lot of good information about what towns are spending, what the composition of their recycling streams are, how much of it is what type of packaging, which producers are contributing the most amount of packaging. We're going to see a lot of this information that we've never seen before when we start this program off. So it's going to be a lot to learn all at once. But we're really hoping that we get as many municipalities started right out of the gate so that they can get that maximum reimbursement, and we're not leaving money on the table. Producers are paying into the system. We want municipalities to take advantage of it. So it also, different towns might have fully baked recycling programs, and some might be starting from scratch. And we're not asking every town to like really wholly invest in a recycling program if they're not ready to do that right now, because it is a municipal investment to get started. And so there's things that they can be doing to be eligible for this money and open the door for themselves so that they can continue to get these reimbursements and build up their programs over time. So really, it could start with just like a simple drop-off location where they provide collection for the readily recyclable materials. And then eventually they could work themselves up to, a fully fledged program with curbside collection or whatever it might be, depending on what's best for them. So we don't have to start, it's not all or nothing. You can start small and work your way up, but use this funding to help you manage your materials and offset those costs. So we want people to get started and really hit the ground running.
It seems like this couple of years between passage of the law and the rules coming out, wow, you use that time well. And I know it wasn't just you, but a lot of good thought has clearly gone into this already. You mentioned that readily recyclable category. Will you say a little bit more about that? Is that like something easy and obvious, like a cardboard box, or what would we expect to see in that category?
Yeah, so they haven't determined exactly what materials is part of the process is determining this list, and that list could change over time. So, as markets become available, like if a producer really wants to see a certain product type be recyclable, they could create infrastructure to recycle it. And could eventually switch those materials from non-recyclable to readily recyclable. So it has the ability to evolve over time, and this list has not been finalized and identified right out of the gate, but there are kind of parameters for what we would decide to be readily recyclable. And it has a lot to do with where the markets are for these materials. Do we have North American markets for recycling a certain type of packaging? What level of access do we have to that sort of recycling in the state? Those kinds of things will factor into what's decided as readily recyclable or not. And some of this is part of that rulemaking process that we've kind of been going into. And so once those rules are approved, we'll have a confirmed, set of parameters to help us decide. But again, the packaging industry has the ability to create some demand and create some markets for this stuff. Creating, they're making the packaging. If they take it back as feedstock and they're recycling it, then there's possibilities that they could be switching from not recyclable to readily recyclable over time. So it's not set in stone for sure, but you can kind of get a sense of what maybe like the steady eddies in the market are. And the ones that have good homes, you could talk to your transfer station operators. They probably have a pretty good idea of which ones are doing well and have good homes. But those would probably be that baseline list for municipalities to collect.
Okay, that's super helpful. And it's really good to hear that there's going to be that sort of fact checking, because we did a lunch and learn a little bit ago about the sort of myth of plastic recycling, and I have not had I stood over the recycling and trash bins in an existential crisis ever since that. It sounds like there are things that those chasing arrows are on more things than my town can genuinely recycle. And it sounds like this might be moving us, closing that gap a little bit.
Yeah. And I mentioned in one of the slides, I believe, talking about labeling as well as one of the incentives for producers to have clear labeling, that there are these eco-modulated fees. And these are additional fees in addition to paying for the end of life disposal costs of managing your packaging, that the state has kind of identified these priorities and what's meeting program goals, and to incentivize certain types of packaging that are, less toxic, easier to recycle, do not create unnecessary contamination, those sorts of things that we want to encourage producers to change their packaging from X to Y. And labeling is a part of that. So labeling creates confusion. If you see the chasing arrows, there's a lot of people that assume that means that it can go in the bin. And so this hopefully will be targeted to get those producers to correctly and clearly label their packaging. And they may pay fees if they're putting out deceptive and greenwashing labeling.
I'm starting to have that moment of, oh boy, we've got a lot more questions than we have minutes left in our program, but I'm going to do some rapid fire ones now. We hear like the sort of go-to opposition argument is, this is all just going to come down to us, right? Producers are going to pass these costs on to consumers. You showed a map where this is happening in a lot of places. What's the headline? Does that happen? Are we going to see our costs go up?
Yeah, we're not seeing any evidence that it does. And when you look at places like Canada, where there are provinces that participate in EPR and provinces that do not, there's no like major changes in the cost of consumer goods there. Like very similar to like how you see, you know, price shifts in Maine versus New Hampshire for the same types of products. So there really isn't any clear evidence that producers are passing this cost along. They find other ways to save the money. So reducing waste in other ways through, you know, reducing energy costs, water consumption, you know, the use of materials, and eliminating unnecessary packaging is one way that they can save money. So we've seen that in other places, that's a common way for them to offset the cost of the program. And again, like the behavior change is what we're trying to drive here, and that's what we've seen in other jurisdictions that implement EPR. So we haven't seen evidence of that, and it's pennies on the dollar for
Amazing.
the packaging. So they just kind of internalize that cost and figure out ways to save money in other places.
Okay. The trash talking world has a lot of phrases that I can't always tell what the difference is. Cradle to cradle, is that a way of saying EPR, or is that a different, and I don't even know what that means. Help me.
Yeah. So I think with extended producer responsibility, this is like, it's onus on the packaging from cradle to grave, but cradle to cradle is possible through EPR because it encourages producers to make something that can then be used again, right? It's creating more circularity in the packaging that they're putting out into the markets. So again, those refill stations, creating more readily recyclable stuff that can be recycled and turned into new goods and products. This is, you know, taking that ownership and rather than it going to grave to the landfill, then it can go back into circularity and be repurposed in the recycling streams, or can just be reused. I mean, I love glass jars are a great example of how the system could be successful. As you know, you have a kiosk and you need to get dish soap or something, and you just grab your container and you refill it. And we've seen businesses try to be those solutions here in Maine. We've got toolkits for that on our website, so please feel free to go check those out. But businesses that support refill and reuse. But yeah, I think it's allowing producers to take accountability for their products from the minute that they're designed and incepted until the consumers are done with them, and creating a more circular system, hopefully cradle to cradle.
Thank you, Vanessa. And thank you to all of you. You asked such good questions. I wish we had time for all of them. I'm so glad we have a plan to get them answered going forward offline. We are so grateful for this partnership. I'll pull the curtain back a little bit and say, I don't know much about this world at all. I'm so grateful for Vanessa and for the work that she does and leads at NRCM, and for all of us. So thank you for being part of it. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn so much today. And thanks for keeping an eye out, everybody, for that follow-up email. There'll be lots of good stuff in it. And you have some spare time to process it and take action, because we are actually going to be off for the month of August. So go ahead and put it on your calendar. Your Fridays at noon are free for comment writing and and recycling and any other things. We will be back in this space after Labor Day. We have a great lineup of presenters for September. One of them just might be your favorite weatherman, so keep an eye out for that. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Friday, your weekend, your summer in Maine. And Vanessa, again, a million thanks. Have a great weekend, and we will see you all again soon.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you so
everybody.
much.